Well, welcome back to segment 3 of this DVD series, and I'm here with Bill Salas, and we're really gonna discuss the timing in this particular DVD because we've discussed a lot in the previous two. But before we do that, as we know, some people might have taken a break from watching the DVDs. Maybe you haven't watched them all in a row. So, Bill, let's take just a few minutes to just give a quick summary of where we've been over the last couple hours.
Absolutely. Well, Ezekiel 38 and 39 starts out with talking about these Gog and Magog invaders. And we have a map and an image up here. He spoke about them in their ancient names, the vernacular of his time. So we would say the general consensus is that this would include Russia and the southern steppes, some of the Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc. Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, maybe Morocco, and Tunisia. Now, this is a formidable offense. The most massive armed and dangerous Mideast invasion of all time will be coming from the uttermost parts of the north upon the mountains of Israel in the latter years. So that's who the general consensus is of who the participants are. Now, we see it's very interesting that as we record this, relationships between Russia, Turkey, and Iran have never been more solidified. These strange bedfellows are in Ezekiel 38. You got communist Russia, you got Shia Iran, and Sunni Turkey coming together. And these relationships, folks, are not going to go away because they have economic interests now. Russia is putting more nuclear facilities in Iran in the Bushehr area. There's going to be Bushehr 2 and Bushehr 3. And Turkey is working with Russia to get the S-400 missile defense system and dealing with that as well. So we're watching that very closely. Now, these countries, another look at them, they actually don't share common borders with Israel. I call them an outer ring, and you see this circle up on the map up there of where they are in proximity. They don't share common borders with Israel. They are predominantly Muslim, except Russia, and they've never been Israel's notorious enemies, in contrast to another circle we're going to look at on a more near map of Israel, surrounding Israel, of the countries that share common borders with Israel, also predominantly Muslim, that I think they're listed in the Psalm 83, which I believe is a prophecy. It probably precedes Ezekiel 38. Here's another look at them in a different map, just so you can kind of get a scope of that inner circle. And you see who's in there is actually Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, etc. So you see that map there as well. Then Ezekiel goes on, and remember, this prophecy is so detailed. We talked about this in the first two DVDs, that we can take it very literally. And so in Ezekiel 38, 7 through 12, after he's identified the belligerents in Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6, he's telling us the details that Israel will find itself in and the motives that Russia will be bringing their hordes down for plunder and booty. We find that in the next sequence of passages. They're going to be Israel will be regathered from the nations. This will take place in the latter years. They will be brought back from the sword of persecution into a land which has long been desolate, and we will put check marks on those conditions because Israel finds themselves in those conditions presently. But there are a few more details we have to look at, and remember, all these details have to be in place before this prophecy can find fulfillment. So are these next few details already existing in Israel? I don't necessarily think so. They have to be a peaceful people. They're living in a land of unwalled villages, dwelling securely, without walls, bars, nor gates, having silver and gold and acquired livestock and goods, possessing booty and great plunder. Because that we find out in the next verse. The protesters on the sidelines are saying, are you coming for this? So let's read this, it's short. Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions will say to you, speaking to Russia and the invaders, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away gold, to take away great plunder? And so these are not invaders, but they're not fighting alongside Israel also. And so Sheba would be Yemen, Dedan would likely be Saudi Arabia. Who are the young lions and the merchants of Tarshish? We discussed the possibility that could include the UK and the USA and in Ezekiel 38. Yes, folks, maybe America is in Bible prophecy, and maybe this is where, as a protester of this massive invasion, which does not speak too highly about our superpower status. Okay, then Ezekiel goes on and talks about how God will supernaturally, because there will be too formidable of an offense for the Israeli Defense Forces, and the American forces, we just said, will not be fighting alongside. So God is going to make a statement here. He's going to show his showmanship and his marksmanship. And he's going to take out these invaders because he has a specific intent and a specific purpose intended for this marquee prophecy. There'll be a great earthquake. Every man's sword will be against his brother. In other words, these are countries with foreign languages. They don't understand each other. They're going to start panicking. It's like an Old Testament slaughter. They start killing each other in the invasion. There'll be pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones and fire and brimstone. And when it's all done, the world will know that was not a normal victory. That was the God of the Jews. And he will say in Ezekiel 39:7, rightly so, this is what Ezekiel says, on behalf of the Lord, so I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. Then the nation shall know that I'm the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. And we made a point in the prior segments to say that this is when God puts the world on official notice that he's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise-keeping God of Jesus Christ. Now, the timing comes into play. When will God find the most optimum time to let the world know that he's the holy God? And he already knows he's the holy God, but he wants the world to know he's the holy God. He's going to give them notice. And so we're going to talk about timing in this video, and this is something we have to factor in. When is the most optimum time for this to happen? And it goes on as we kind of wind down here because the details are so specific. In the aftermath of this victory, supernatural victory by God, the Israelis will burn the weapons for 7 years. They'll actually convert them into fuel. They will also be burying the dead in a valley called Hamagog, which does not exist just yet. You won't find it on the Google Maps, but you will find it after Ezekiel 38. And they'll be burying the dead for 7 months, burning the weapons for 7 years. And in the process, the world will be in awe. Israel will gain world renown. Now, take just a moment to talk about the weapons that will be burning for 7 years. Weapons for fuel. I want to read the NIV version because they make it pretty clear in this version. Now, those who live in the towns of Israel. Now, the people living in the towns of Israel will be Israelis. Okay, some people. This gets into timing issues, which we'll talk about. But be clear that we're talking about Israelis living in the towns inside of Israel. Will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up. The small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the wars, clubs, the spears. For 7 years, they will use them for fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest because they will use the weapons for fuel. Now, you might find this interesting, but America has already been using Russian nuclear weapons for fuel. Here's a few headlines that I think you might find interesting. This is the NPR, and this is back in 2013. Megatons to megawatts. Russian warheads fuel U.S. power plants. New York Times put one out in 2009. Power for U.S. from Russia's old nuclear weapons. So the technologies to convert nuclear weapons into fuel already exist. Russian nuclear warheads provided electricity for the U.S. for 20 years, according to a recent article in March of 21 of this year. Then we're going to get into their burying the dead. We talked about where will they be burying the dead. It'll be in Hamagog, the valley of Hamagog, which will be east of some sea, where the details were given, that will obstruct travelers. We looked at the candidate seas. Could it be the Mediterranean? East of that would be Israel proper? Not likely. Contaminated soldiers being buried in Israel proper. Sea of Galilee, that's where Syria is on the other side of the Golan Heights over there. Not a prime candidate choice also at that point. The Red Sea would be too far to deploy transport all these bodies down to the east side of that. And the east side of that is pretty much Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, they wouldn't really like that.
The Dead Sea. Okay, that's my choice. We're not told exactly what sea, but we are told this east of some sea. And there you have central Jordan, which at some point Israel will take possession of in advance of this prophecy. I point that out in my Now Prophecies book, in my Psalm 83 book as well. And that's central Jordan. And that is a prime place. It'll be easy for Israel to transport those bodies over there, and it'll be with wind patterns and things like that. That's actually the best place.
Downwind, why not?
To put this. Now, I want to just say, some people think Ezekiel 38 and Psalm 83 are the same prophecy. Just take a moment to clear the air on that. Psalm 83 is Arabs versus Jews. Ezekiel 38 is mostly non-Arabs versus Jews. There are different enemies. You've got the inner circle we looked at on that map. You've got the outer ring of Ezekiel 38. The motive of Psalm 83 is to take the land, the promised land, for possession. But as we just noted, Russia is coming with its hordes to take plunder and booty, not the land. The defeats of the Psalm 83 countries would be the Israeli Defense Forces, The Lord supernaturally defeats Russia. The different results would be there'd be end of the ancient hatred that's plagued the region, the Middle East, from time immemorial. And the results of Ezekiel 38 is God will uphold his holy name. Now, folks, we're talking about predominantly Muslim countries. So I believe what will happen is Allah will lose his Akbar after these two prophecies. Akbar means the greater. So in other words, the Muslims, they shout Allahu Akbar. They're talking about Allah is the greater God. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not so. Yeah. And we're going to show you in a minute, Allah and Jehovah are not the same God either. So Psalm 83, I believe, will be a punch to the gut of Islam. Ezekiel 38, when it's defeated by God, will be an uppercut to the jawbone of Islam. And by the tribulation period, when it starts, and we will talk about the favorable, what we believe is timing is actually a pre-tribulation timing of Ezekiel 38. We're going to give you all the other arguments.
Yep.
Islam will be knocked out for the 10 count now. Folks, just be clear as I say my final words on this review. Jehovah and Allah are not the same God. Some people are starting to try to connect Allah and Jehovah together, and that's just not going to work. Islam rejects the deity of Jesus Christ in Surah 5:17 of the Quran. Islam rejects his death on the cross in Surah 4 of the Quran. Surah 5 says, "O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as allies. They are allies of one another, and whoever is an ally to them among you, then indeed he is one of them. Indeed, Allah guides not the wrongdoing people." So if you're a Jew or a Christian, according to Surah 5:51, you are a wrongdoing people not blessed by God. And then lastly, I think this is the one that really convinces. Surah 4 says that, so believe in Allah and his apostles, say not Trinity, God the Father, the Holy, Jesus Christ the Son, and then the Holy Spirit. This is that we better for you, for Allah is one Allah, glory be to him, far exalted to see above even having a son.
Yep.
Now, raise your hand if you believe Jesus Christ is the only begotten Son of God. So that's it. There's also another prophecy dealing with Iran. We're not going to get into this here. I've written about it, but and it's dealing with Persia and Elam. So Iran is a subject of dual prophecies in the end times. Ezekiel wrote about, in Ezekiel 35, about 38 verse 5, about Persia, but Jeremiah, his contemporary, wrote about 10 years before the Ezekiel 38 prophecy. Jeremiah wrote around 596 BC. He wrote about Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49. So just so you see on a map of modern-day Iran, you have Persia, which is about 2/3 of modern-day Iran, and hugging the Persian Gulf on the coast, you see Elam. Now, we'll just end it here, and I'll tell you, I've written about this in my book called Nuclear Showdown, Revealing the Ancient Prophecy of Elam. Okay, so with that said, let's turn it back to you now.
Yeah.
And let's get into the timing.
No, I appreciate you giving that review because, again, a couple hours, a lot there. But as we transition into the timing, this is one of the, really, I think, one of the most exciting parts of this discussion. And we also want to say that there's a lot of different viewpoints, and we want to address each one. And we want this whole teaching that we're doing to be thorough, and we want to be gracious and really not leave any stone unturned. So as we think about the timing, really there's 5 principles that we have that are in general that give us really some broad characteristics. We're going to get into some of the details, but when we think about the prophecy, the first thing is that Ezekiel very clearly says in 38, 8, and 16 that this is in the latter years, okay? This isn't somewhere close in the sense of like the time of Jesus or whatever, but we know it's in the latter time. So that gives us an insight. And, when we think about that language, and especially in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus speaks about the end of the age, and we are living in the end of the age. The second thing that we see as a general characteristic is that God really defines, and there's other passages, but that it would be after this war would happen, after Israel has been regathered into the land from multiple nations, not just the Babylonian captivity. So that tells us that Ezekiel is speaking to a time that is not immediate within a generation of himself when they would come back after 70 years, because that's when he gave his prophecy. This would be further down the line, multiple countries in the latter years, and we clearly have seen that, 1948.
Absolutely, that's a good point. And the other one's going to come up, one of the arguments, well, what about the time of Esther?
Yeah, hold that, too, so, because that's good, because this is going to address that specific issue. There are those really we don't that believe in the time of Esther, but the third thing we see is modern alliances. We shared a video here, which if you look at the alliances that are going on now and of the players, again, we really couldn't even say this 25 years ago. We're watching it happen. We have the videos to show it. They're all holding hands. They're getting along. The fourth thing that we see as a general characteristic is Israeli wealth. Over and over, we see in the passage that there's a hooks in the jaws that God is drawing Gog out. They're coming down to seize and to take great spoil. We see the protesters making that comment as well. Let's spend a moment talking about Israeli wealth. Again, if we go back 30 years ago, we're talking about timing. What sort of wealth did they really have 30 years ago versus now? How have things changed?
Right. Well, how have things changed presently? I didn't chart their economy 30 years ago, but I will tell you right now, they're a burgeoning economy. And I think it was 2009, 2010, respectively, they discovered natural gas. I might have the years wrong, but they discovered natural gas out in the Mediterranean with the Leviathan discovery and the Tamar 1 discovery. Those are going to be wealthy assets from natural resources. A lot of people suspect they might even find oil under the soil.
Yeah.
So we'll see about that. That's a little speculation on our part.
Trillions of cubic feet. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying that they could really fuel their own country for decades or generations. One of the other interesting things on the wealth part of it is, we know that Russia is one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas in the world, and they supply much of Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, with these products. And there's been some tension there between certainly Russia and Ukraine and other parts in Eastern Europe over the delivery. A few years ago, they shut it off as a threat, as a political threat. And Israel said, hey, well, we're happy to share our wealth with you and bring a pipeline up through Greece and in there, which really, people can go back and find it, that made Russia mad.
That's right. And the Leviathan discovery was just huge. And they said at that point, we will now be energy independent as a Jewish state. The Tamar one, they said, well, now we'll be actually an exporter as a Jewish state. And then we also got the technological developments. Yep. They're far advanced than many countries, and they're exporting their technologies and things like that. Their produce, their farming, their agriculture, they send a lot of products out to the world from that aspect. The Hebrew word, when it says spoil, is shalal, and it can also mean spoil from the despoilers. So if they're engaged in a war with the Arabs prior, they would certainly, I think, expand territorially a little bit. They would take over, I think they'll take over Jordan. I've got notes on that in my Now Prophecies book. So they would have assets also along accumulating that way as well, spoils of war.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because what we've seen recently is, we talked about this a little bit, was the United States brought $80 billion worth of stuff to Afghanistan. The Taliban took over, and they absorbed all of that weaponry. Well, if I was to ask you, which country is equipping the immediate enemies of Israel right now? Who is the greatest contributor of that?
Well, Russia, certainly.
You would probably say Russia.
Yeah, but America as well. So
America as well.
As Saudi Arabia, we're giving them and right now, Saudi Arabia and Israel seem to be kind of friends, because there's an old saying that says, the enemy in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the enemy of each other is Iran and their nuclear developments, trying to spread their hegemony throughout the Middle East to their proxies, which they're already doing. Yeah. Give them a nuclear weapon, they will even have more impetus in that area. So the enemy, my enemy, Israel and Saudi Arabia, is my friend against Iran.
Yeah. We need to remember that it could be that part of the desire for Russia to be involved is maybe to come back down and retrieve some of their weaponry that they've brought in, that Israel has plundered through the Psalm 83 situation or whatever. I mean, our country, there's been a lot of discussion recently in the news about sending in troops simply just to recover our $80 billion investment. So could Russia do that as well? Again, it's part of the language in the Hebrew there. So there's a variety of ways in which we're looking at the general timing of the wealth of Israel, which is one of the hooks of the jaws to come in. The fifth thing, which I think is worth spending time on as we talk about the general characteristics, is going to shape a lot of the rest of the discussion as the specific timing, and that is Israel is dwelling and living securely. It talks about it living quietly or peacefully, and without walls, without bars, without gates. Um, let's talk about that. I know you have a couple slides on this, which I think would be helpful for our audience here, because this really is one of the keys. There are different perspectives on this. Again, people, we're going to agree to disagree agreeably, but we want to provide and we want to interact, because whether it's in archaeology, it's my context, or even scripture, is everybody has the same data. We all have the same text. We all are going to come in, but we're going to come in with, and we're going to look at it all. We're going to try to reconcile it all with the rest of scripture, other prophecies in Jeremiah, for sure, Isaiah. And we're going to come and say, how do all of these things, how do all of these texts, how can we reconcile them in a way that's very logical and coherent in order to develop the most reasoned theological interpretation? We're not throwing stones at anybody else here, but we just want to interact. So I might play devil's advocate here, which will be helpful in the sense of the discussion, but we have here very clearly, I'll read it, Ezekiel 38:11. You will say, God is talking to Gog, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful or quiet people who dwell safely or securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Is this the situation that we see in Israel right now? So let's take, share, if you will, the other position that you don't necessarily hold. Some people say, what?
Well, before I say what some people say, and before what I say, remember the Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy we prefaced in the first two DVDs, part of this set, can be taken very literally. Mm-hmm. So I think we want to stay on track with that and take this passage literally as well.
Yeah.
Now, when they talk about dwelling securely, a lot of people who think Ezekiel 38, all the conditions are ripe for it to happen, that it's actually almost imminent at this point. And it's certainly coming close. We see these alliances building and things like that. Is that it mainly is dealing with a relative term about Israel's ability to defend itself, their own confidence in their own security. Mm-hmm. I'm going to show you why I don't think that's what Ezekiel's intending in a couple of slides here. But that's the argument. Would you agree that's the argument that some of them have?
You know, and we talk about literal, but we also want to watch our words, because that person, they're going to say, well, didn't you just say a few minutes ago that you don't take it as literal horses and literal chariots? And we're going to say, well, yeah, we understand that literalness is speaking about something true. You know, a horse might be a chariot or a tank. So we want to understand that. They would probably say, well, in the same way that this is speaking of not necessarily literal unwalled villages or whatever, literal bars and gates, but it's speaking generally in the same way the other person would speak about the chariots and the bows and the arrows. It's speaking generally about its ability to dwell safely or securely. So we want to be fair, you know, to that language. And also we want to really remind everybody that, hey, we're doing the best we can here. We want to be humble, but we also want to take it straightforward. We don't want to minimize or overlook something. So that the one position is it's ripe right now. There's nothing else that needs to be done, but that's just one position. Let's talk about a different position.
Right. You're so kind to the other side. And we don't want to be dogmatic, absolutely. What you just said about the bucklers and the shields and the horses, again, at Ezekiel's time, he did not have nuclear weapons and things like that. Mm-hmm. But he did have walls, right, and bars and things like that. And there's walls and bars today. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we can say, well, he wasn't talking about the same kind of thing we're talking about today that exists in conditions like that.
It's good to be precise here. This is good, I mean, to answer.
So he's talking about them dwelling safely without walls, bars, nor gates. Well, as you see in the slide, they have a major wall, 403-mile long partition wall. At some point, it's 20 feet tall, filled with concrete. And that has been designed to keep Palestinian terrorism out of Israel proper. Now, some people would say, well, because I think when they sort of just glance over this particular section here, they kind of have to say it the way they say it, the other proponents of the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because if you look at it literally, Israel does have walls, bars, and gates all around it. Matter of fact, the whole country has walls protecting it around from the north. It's one of the most fenced in and fortified countries in the Middle East, which is the most fenced in and fortified region in the world. And you have border walls keeping Hezbollah out to the north of Lebanon. You've got borders on the east over by Jordan. You got walls keeping the Palestinians and the Hamas out of the Gaza. So we have that existing already. Now, if we simply said it doesn't necessarily violate the text to say, well, they're just, it's not really literally dwelling safely without walls, bars, and gates. I would say if we did this, I'm going to just do kind of a little slide thing here just to see. So what we would do is, if it didn't violate the text, what we would do is we'd take out the unpart of walled villages to peaceful people dwelling safely, and we would say with walls, because they're dwelling safely with walls right now, and having bars and gates, because Israel has security checkpoints all over the place.
Yeah.
Now, if we found that scenario in the text, we would not be violating the text. So if we saw that it go against the land of walled villages, people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling with walls, and having bars and gates, I should take out the nor, but
that's right.
I think they get the point.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So that's one thing. Now, so the question is, what does the Hebrew word dwelling securely really mean? Yeshav v'tak.
Yeah.
It shows up 2 times: dwelling safely, dwelling securely. The Jews were brought out of the nations, and now they all dwell safely or securely. Yeshav v'tak. Verse 11, Ezekiel 38, the unwalled villages, I go to peaceful people who dwell safely. Yeshav v'tak. All of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. So Israel, I believe Ezekiel is giving us a definition of they can dwell securely, not because of their own confidence in their military capabilities, but because their enemies around them have been dealt with. And we have precedent from that. Ezekiel tells us when that will happen. 10 chapters earlier in Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 26. And what he says, thus says Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered and hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I have given to my servant Jacob. Well, that's what's going on, right? And they will dwell safely, Yeshav v'tak. They will build houses, plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely, Yeshav v'tak. But the prerequisite for that is when I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know the Lord. I'm the Lord their God. So in other words, there are people around Israel who despise them that will have judgments executed upon them, and enable Israel to dwell Yeshav v'tak. And we pointed out in an image earlier that I suspect he's talking about those people in the inner circle of Psalm 83.
Yeah.
So, and this is not a DVD about Psalm 83, but so we'll kind of leave it at that for now.
Well, let's provide a little bit of clarity there, just so that the audience, as you're watching this, you understand what we're discussing here. Because the idea would be, again, we have these 2 perspectives, scholars on both sides. It's kind of exciting to see the bantering back and forth. When you see this word as well, we want to make sure that we're bringing forth the Hebrew. The Bible does talk about them. In English, it says peacefully. Well, the word peace isn't there. It's quietly. And the question is, what does that mean? Because some people on the other side would say, well, it doesn't require that there be some peace agreement, because don't get stuck on the word peaceful, it's quiet. The other side, again, as we're discussing here, let's wrap it up. The idea would be that there's between now and the beginning of this war, with the Ezekiel 38 and 39 participants, before that time, there would be some level of situation or war which Israel would remove their enemies that are in their more immediate proximity. Because of that, they wouldn't feel as threatened by Hezbollah would be gone or neutralized. All of Jordan, even the Palestinians would be neutralized to some degree. Therefore, they wouldn't have need. Those walls that you just showed would be taken down. Would that be fair?
I think that would be the natural byproduct of the judgments being executed upon those neighbors around them that despise them. And those walls come down quickly. We saw how quickly the Berlin Wall came down.
So that's Ezekiel 28, which is, again, a very interesting passage, using similar Hebrew language right before. I like seeing things intertextual, because Ezekiel's using the same language, and we're able to compare. And there, a great passage in discussing people who despise them. They're no doubt despised by their immediate surroundings, and God is going to execute judgments, if that's the case in this Psalm 83, situation. So with that, we got a little bit of time left here. Those are the general characteristics, latter years, Israel's been brought back as a nation, modern alliances, Israel has tremendous wealth, and even there, They could gain more wealth. If they were to take over parts of Jordan and Syria, would they get the oil that's there? Would these other nations want to come down and take it back? Is that what draws Russia? Because Russia has invested quite a bit into Syria, especially in their bases and their seaports up along the Mediterranean coast. We also have here, again, this idea of Israel dwelling securely, confidently, quietly, all those things. So let's jump in. There's really 7 main options for the timing. I'd love to address them very particularly just so because we want to be thorough. The first one I think is probably one of the easiest ones, and I'm not even going to include it in the 7, but it's one that is often brought up with those who are either preterist in their perspective and their eschatology or partial preterist. They say, man, you guys looking at this Ezekiel 38, there's nothing to see here. The Ezekiel 38 conflagration was fulfilled in the time of Esther. So, really maybe 100, 150 years after the time of the Babylonian captivity, maybe 100 years or so after really 600. So let's jump into, let's say 480 BC, the Persian period, Esther period. Haman is seeking to attack the Jews. We know the story. We can't get into all of it. But a thing goes out. Everybody can attack the Jews. That's really what Ezekiel's talking about. Your response.
Right. Okay. Well, and a preterist would not necessarily agree with this, but those weren't the latter years. And then this happens in the latter years. That was a general requirement you talked about. There was Persia, okay, that was coming against the Jews, and not the other multiplicity of nations that Gog is putting together, Russia and Turkey.
A big multiplicity of nations.
Yeah, so it was, that was just one particular country involved. This attack, invasion of Israel is going to come from the uttermost parts of the north, and Iran is far due east, and it's going to come upon the mountains of Israel. Well, the whole thing there was not anywhere near Israel. That Persia thing was dealing with
Persia. If we look at their territory, they weren't up in the north, right? They didn't have a territory in the uttermost parts of the north.
No. Okay. And the Jews were not in Israel. I mean, the Jews that Haman was going after were in the Persian area around there. That were not on the mountains of Israel.
Yeah, on the mountains of Israel.
So I don't see how that could even be a candidate.
Yeah, so again, we bring that up because we want to be thorough, and I have friends that are of that perspective, the partial preterist view, and they want to see this as having nothing future, and we just say, hey, we love you, brother, but we just strongly disagree, and we're going to do it with love and kindness. But so let's get into some of the other ones that we think are really the most serious and really the most compelling. The first one is that this war is going to happen both before the rapture and the tribulation. So let's talk about that, because we can certainly say that we think this is the strongest contender. But before the rapture and the tribulation, we have the pros, 7-year time frame, the ability there to burn the weapons. The major elements of Islam are destroyed in maybe a Psalm 83 situation, leaving a religious vacuum. There's a spiritual revival of the Jews that could happen after that, where they get a little bit more confident. They are dwelling again securely and safely. Let's spend some time on the weapons, because the burning of the 7-year weapons really is one of the deciding factors in all of the timings. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, that's a very important clue, and I think it's an important timing clue. Before I engage with that one, I'll tell you why I lean towards the pre-tribulation view of the timing of Ezekiel 38. And I even go so far as to suggest, because we can't say when the rapture is imminent, it could happen at any given time. And Ezekiel 38, the church could be here for that. The rapture could happen before, during, or after Ezekiel 38. But I believe that the arguments we're about to share favor a pre-tribulation timing of Ezekiel 38. First of all, Ezekiel 38 verses 14, 16, and Ezekiel 39 verse 7 clearly talks about this is dealing with my people Israel. They're brought back in the land, the chosen people of the Abrahamic covenant, my people Israel. There's no need for the church to be here per se. Okay, so one could be after the rapture, but I'm not saying for sure. The other thing I brought up earlier says this is the event God's going to use to make his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel. Now, when would be the optimum time for God to put the world on official notice after such a major Ezekiel 38 defeat prophecy? Would it be at the end of the tribulation when everybody's got the mark of the beast and God says, "Oh, I should have done it earlier." I don't think so, folks. I think the perfect time for God to put forward his holy name notice to the world is before the tribulation. He would say, "You have a clear choice. Here I am. My name is holy. You just saw what I accomplished to uphold my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Because around the corner here in the tribulation, you're going to be given deception, and an Antichrist is going to come on the scene. And down the road, he's ultimately going to try to get you to force to worship him. So learn about me now, worship me now before you encounter that. Now, the other one that I think is really critically important is the timing of the weapons that you brought forward. So Israel burns the weapons for 7 years. So when would that start, and how long could that go? 7 years. But what would stop it? What abruptly could stop that? Well, let's look. When you understand the tribulation period, it's 7 years, and it's broken into two compartments: 3.5 years in the first half, and it's 3.5 years in the second half. It's called the Great Tribulation because the tribulation in the second half is actually a lot greater actually than the first half. So what's going on in the first half with the Jewish people? They've confirmed a covenant. The Antichrist has confirmed a covenant with them and the many. That's in Daniel 9:27. And so therefore, for the first 3.5 years, they're living in a pseudo peace. It's pseudo because it's going to be violated in the middle by the abomination of desolation when the Antichrist goes into the temple at the midpoint of the tribulation and probably abominates the temple at that point. Now, so they're dwelling at peace for the first 3.5 years. They could burn weapons.
Yeah.
Okay. And they could have burned weapons for 3.5 years prior to that period of time if Ezekiel 38 had concluded 3.5 years before the confirmation of the false covenant that starts the tribulation. Now, so they could easily be burning 7 years worth of weapons up to that point, but they're at peace. The second half, and Jesus says when the abomination of desolation occurs in Matthew 24, verses 15, you need to flee. You need to flee into the mountains. We say that would probably be going over into Petra, southern Jordan.
Yeah.
They're going to be running for their life because the Antichrist is going to be trying to commit genocide of the Jews. We're told in Zechariah 13:8 that 2/3 of the Jews in the land will actually be cut off, will be killed. So they're not going to be having the luxury of burning weapons. They're going to be fleeing for their lives, probably grabbing a weapon to defend themselves. So I, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Dr. David Reagan, I believe yourself as well, and many others believe that this is a clue that this is a pre-tribulation event. They can burn weapons for 3.5 years before the tribulation, 3.5 years into the tribulation. They may have 8 or 9 years worth of weapons, we don't know, but it abruptly could stop at the midpoint when they have to flee for their lives. So I think that argument is pretty compelling.
Yeah. Let's summarize this again, because part of the way that we want to understand, as we want to bring all Scripture together, is people need to grasp the distress that is happening in the second half of the tribulation. We see this in Daniel chapter 12, a time of distress, the same language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24, that this is a time of trouble that has never existed in the history of the world up until that time and never again. And so when we think about that, we take Matthew 24, we take Daniel 12, we take even Revelation 12, where you have the dragon and being cast out of heaven, the war between Michael and his angels being thrown down to the earth. Because why? He has short time. And then he empowers the Antichrist at that time. We have the deadly wound being healed in chapter 13. But you also have there that when the dragon is thrown down, he turns his eye towards the woman, who we know as Israel because of a lot of reasons. And she flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days, this 3.5 year period. And the dragon is pursuing her. God brings up the land to stop the flood. So this second half of the tribulation, which we call the Great Tribulation, there is no just living life normal, let's burn some weapons. As Jesus mentioned, they don't even have time when that abomination of desolation is set up. He said, don't even go get your coat. Get out of town, flee to the mountains. And I think from Isaiah 63, the language there is talking about Bozrah. Who is this who comes from Bozrah, which is the land of Petra and the land of Jordan? And we know from other passages that when Jesus returns, he's coming to rescue them from the land of Bozrah. His robe is dipped in blood, and then he makes his way to Zechariah 14 and the Mount of Olives. So you have them fleeing. This isn't a normal time. So to perceive that this 7-year period would extend throughout all of the time of the tribulation really doesn't fit all the rest of the biblical data.
Right, and remember that when they're burying the dead for 7 years and burning the weapons, converting them to fuel for 7 months, they're gaining world renown.
Yeah.
Okay, They're not gaining world renown in the second half of
No.
the tribulation. They're fleeing for their lives.
For the very existence, the
of
genocidal
the nation,
existence.
yeah. The nation is a threat at that point.
So we have a slide here. Maybe you're going to bring that up, which I think is helpful for us to see. Right here, we have on here the abomination of desolation in the middle. The right two halves, you see the 3.5 and the 3.5. The last 3.5 years, again, they're fleeing. It's hard to conceive that they're burning weapons. So if we were to, as you mentioned, Bill, Ezekiel, he doesn't say that. All he says is they burned it for 7. He doesn't say why. Maybe they had 10 years or 20 years worth, because as we saw in the other clip or the other article that you showed, that the United States, 20 years worth of fuel.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but we see something. It doesn't say it was stopped, but we know that it was stopped at 7 years. And so if we extrapolate backwards from the 7 years, we get before the 7-year tribulation into the Gog war beginning. And so we have a rapture here in 2 different places because we don't know. The rapture could occur prior to the Gog war, or it could occur after.
Right, exactly. And if it occurs prior to the Ezekiel 38, that puts Ezekiel 38, if it's pre-tribulation, in the gap.
In the gap.
That gap that's sort of getting more attention now.
It is.
It's a post-rapture gap because it happens after the rapture. Mm-hmm. It's not the rapture that starts the tribulation. It's a confirmation of the false covenant of Daniel 9:27 and Isaiah 28 verses 15. So it would fit into the gap. And if the weapons burning is going on for 3.5 years, that would actually make the gap a minimum of 3.5 years. Now, we don't know this, folks.
Yeah.
And the gap, many people believe in the gap, but it's an unspecified period of time. So we're going to say, hey, it could be up to 3.5 years at that point.
But it's interesting, though. Let's do a little timing. We're not prophets, but if the first perspective is that the Gog-Magog war happens before the rapture and the tribulation. Let's go on to the next one, number 2, that it happens after the rapture in the gap, but before the tribulation. So it would be interesting that if the rapture happens right before the tribulation there, and if we were to see, this is interesting, if we were to see the Gog-Magog war, let's say the church is still here, and we saw them immediately start burning the weapons, I know what I would do. I'd start calculating 7 years, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
Because we know that it is only 7 years, and then it has to end at the abomination of desolation. So my clock would begin to go, man, we got 3.5 years, most likely, until the beginning of the tribulation period. But we also see, let's run with that again, that let's say we see the war. Let's say it happens in a year from now. Psalm 83 has already happened. They're doing that. And then Russia immediately wants to come down and collect all their stuff. Well, by the Psalm 83 happening, we come and there's going to be some world chaos, in a variety of ways. So if, I can think all day. You tell me your thoughts on this.
Well, I would say this. You said if the church sees this, start calendaring 7 years. I would say to you, look sincerely into your eyes right now, if you start seeing this invasion and God stopping it and Israel starting to convert weapons from the Gog of Magog invaders for 7 years, that means one of two things. It means they've only got 7 years worth of weapons to convert and then they run out, or there's 7 years until the Antichrist in the mid part of the tribulation is going to happen. So you need to be calendaring 7 years. If you got left behind and the church isn't here and you're seeing that going on, this is a clue to you that time is getting very, very short.
Yeah. So now let's go to the second one, really, which is the rapture. The rapture's happened. There's chaos in the world. That's kind of where I was going. There's chaos in the world. There's been a weakening, certainly, of all countries, especially the United Nations, or the United States. We have the situation where Russia and these nations could say, hey, wow, this really provides a vacuum of leadership or really power struggle, world powers. Let's do it right now. I mean, that's one option, right? That it's in this gap after the rapture, but before the tribulation.
That's right. And that's sort of the one we're favoring.
Yeah.
Right, as a possibility. Because 3 times he talks about them as my people Israel. Mm-hmm. And in the aftermath of the supernatural victory by God, I think it's 2 or 3 times it's referenced in Ezekiel 39, the Jews are cleansing the land. Now, of course, they got to cleanse the land from contaminated dead corpses, But also that's a ritual requirement of a reinstated Mosaic law. The law, you have to cleanse the land. I believe they're going to gravitate toward the Mosaic law at that point, and I think at that point they're going to want to build their temple, the third Jewish temple. So I think that's why I lean in that direction, and not just me. Like I said, there's some other notables who agree with that.
The challenge would be is if you don't mind, bring that one slide back up, because if the beginning, let's say the rapture happens, and there has to be, what we're saying is this 3.5 year period before the beginning of the tribulation. So the rapture, again, we know it could happen 10 years before the tribulation. It can happen 1 minute before. But if the Gog-Magog war began 1 week before the 7-year tribulation, now we have the fuel problem, because they're not going to be burning the fuel during the 7-year periods, the whole 7-year period. So it does kind of force it. So you can see where our perspective or our preference is for the timing of this, because we think it brings most of the data together. But let's go to another one here. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the Gog-Magog war beginning either at the beginning or in the first half of the tribulation. Maybe we have there the peace of the first half, the pseudo peace that you mentioned. So for those that take this perspective, they're going to say, yeah, the Antichrist has confirmed the covenant. He's helping to secure peace. Israel is building their temple. This is great. They're enjoying unprecedented prosperity guaranteed by the Antichrist. This is the peace that Ezekiel's talking about. Once the war happens, these Muslim nations are removed out of the way. Thus, it would contribute potentially to the Antichrist's rise in authority, because he's filling a vacuum. It might also give rise to the harlot. So I can see where they're coming from. So how do we consider the pros? What are the cons for? Those are the pros for that happening at the beginning or in the middle part or the first part of the tribulation. What are the cons?
Right. And this would be, and there's a lot of people who do believe it starts at that time we're talking about. So it's a pretty popular argument. It would be my second choice if I wasn't hung up on the burning of the weapons thing, because I think there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. So they think that the peace that Israel enjoys is brought about by the confirmation of the false covenant. So in other words, it's not militarily achieved through like a Psalm 83 scenario or the peripheral prophecies of Psalm 83, but it's right here that they get that peaceful scenario. And so, I mean, that is a scenario, but I think the problem with that is dealing with burning those weapons at that point in time. Another
aspect too, which I think doesn't work in the favor, is God goes in and he just does this massive supernatural intervention in order to bring about his holy name. And then maybe it's at the beginning or maybe it's in the middle of that first half, and then he turns around and just allows them to be persecuted by the Antichrist. That seems a little bit problematic that he would do that. So that's one perspective. Let's go to another perspective.
Let me say one thing first. Regarding the people who advocate, some people have said the argument, well, the way around the burning the weapons in the second half is, well, what about civilians and just other people who can burn the weapons there? Not necessarily just the Jews, because the Jews are fleeing. But it clearly says those in the towns of Israel. They're talking about Israeli inhabitants.
It's talking about the land.
I've had to deal with that argument a little bit too.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, we love getting objections because it helps us to refine, our perspective on it. One of the ones that I think is probably one of the most favored by many people is that the Gog-Magog war coincides with Armageddon. Let me give a couple of the pros for those that take this view. It's in the latter years. Both texts mention a feast for animals. That really is a huge deal for many people. They say, well, clearly Ezekiel's talking about a feast or a supper for animals. Revelation 19 does too. Number 3, Israel will know God from that day forward, Ezekiel 39 and 22. And also Ezekiel 39:7, that God says, my name will not be profaned any longer. If it happens at the end, they will have come to know God, and certainly through Jesus Christ, they'll mourn, or they will come to that place of recognizing, and therefore there's no time after that for them to profane God's name. If it happens over there, as you mentioned, in any time before that, they're still going to be profaning God's name throughout the tribulation period until the end. So I think that's a good thing in their favor. What are some cons to?
Well, I understand.
Let's answer those.
I understand that profane thing, but in Ezekiel 36, it talks about the definition of what God's meaning by them profaning His name. It talks about when they're in the nations of the world in the diaspora in Ezekiel 36, that His holy name was being profaned, and that He was going to bring them back in the land of Israel, and that was fulfilled in 1948, to make His holy name known through His people Israel, to vindicate His name, which happens in Ezekiel 38. When they were out in the diaspora, the profaning of His name, in essence, that I think is the context that we should be looking at, was that to the nations, they saw that as, your God is a weak God. He can't even keep you in your homeland. And they were doing nothing on the world scene at that time to uphold God's holy name. And they were doing really nothing to deserve it at that time to be brought back into the land of Israel. But because God made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He had to bring them back in the land, the promised land, the chosen people back in the land. And under that environment, He would then uphold His holy name. So yes, the Jews will not, I believe if this Ezekiel 38 happens before the tribulation or early into the tribulation, that a lot of the Jews will still, especially if it's before, because they confirm a covenant with the Antichrist. Certainly, they're not necessarily going to all jump on the Jesus train per se. But the profaning of His name, I think, has to do, they won't be on the nations of the world with the same resemblance of we're profaning God's name, our God's weak, that sort of thing.
You know, let me just reiterate that, because when we look at the language of Ezekiel, the profaning of His name is tied to them being out of the land. And the fact that they're in the land and God comes to a supernatural rescue is evidence that He is their God, and them being there is putting on not just them, but He's putting the world on notice. I am the God of Israel. I have brought them from all the nations, and you guys scattered them, whether it was Rome or whether it was Nebuchadnezzar. They're back in the land, and I am not going to allow my name to be profaned, which another way to say is, I'm not going to allow them to be kicked out of the land again. Is that a fair assessment of Ezekiel's profaning?
Yeah, and well, they disperse as Jesus says they should at the midpoint of the tribulation, but it's not the same worldwide dispersion kind of thing like that. So I think that has more relevance. That thing. The other thing too about the comparing of the sacrificial meal of the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. In Ezekiel 38, He does identify birds of the air and beasts of the earth. And when He says the sacrificial meal will occur, it's dealing with eating the flesh of the mighty men, the armies and stuff. Whereas Ezekiel 30, Revelation 19, only talks about the birds of the air. It doesn't talk about the beasts of the earth. They could be there, but it's not in the text.
It's not,
And it talks about more than just the armies of the Antichrist. It talks about all flesh being eaten by them and other things like that. So I think we have two, and we pointed this out in the DVD, the earlier set, DVD disc, that there are two different sacrificial meals in my estimation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you got to make the Antichrist Gog.
Yeah, exactly. You're conflating those two figures, which I think are clearly different. There's a couple other things that we could say in the sense of having the Armageddon and the Gog war being the same. They seem very clearly in different locations. One is on in the mountains of Israel, as we saw, and the other one is in the broad plain. The nations are different. There's a worldwide confederacy versus really a regional confederacy, if you want to say that. There's different leaders. They come there in Gog to attack Israel, where we know that in the Armageddon scenario, it says very clearly they turn their weapons at Jesus. They're coming there in a central location, but they're there to attack. Psalm 2, right? The nations are raging. The defeat, we know in Armageddon that it's the breath of Jesus' mouth versus earthquake, hail, and some other things. The other thing that we ask is, are they going to start burning the weapons in the millennium? That's really problematic, because we imagine, as we discussed in other sections, just about this idea of the millennium beginning with Jesus' 75-year interval and other things. So we don't have a lot of time.
Well, let me just say one thing about that. Micah 4:2 says, "From out of Zion the law shall go forth, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples and rebuke strong nations afar. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." In other words, they're converting the weapons into farming implements.
Not fuel.
Not converting them into fuel.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so we got a couple more here. What about the timing of, let's say, between the tribulation, when the tribulation ends and the start of the millennium, that Jesus has come back, he's rescued Israel. This is in other contexts, we talked about the 75-day interval. Israel, what would be the pro? Well, the Israels would be living, confidently, securely, because now they have Jesus's protection. This is a little bit more difficult, I think, in trying to understand, because Jesus's victory is thorough. Who are going to be these nations right at the beginning of the millennium? I don't know where would they come from, and how would they organize something to come down and to attack Israel? It just seems very problematic on a variety of ways. It doesn't fit. There's no burying of the dead. I mean, how are they going to be burying the dead of this nation that come in, and Jesus is sitting there just watching this?
Well, I just put out a Millennium Prophecies DVD that you're going to want to watch, because there's just too much going on in that 75-day interval for this to even have a fathom of possibility for this to happen.
So we can kind of dismiss that. Some people will put it as at the beginning of the millennium. Here Jesus starts it, the millennium, he's ruling from Jerusalem. He's already built the new temple, Ezekiel 40 through 48. He has done all of the geographic, topographical changes, a broad plain. There's going to be the mountain of the Lord, peace and harmony. The lion is laying down with the lamb, all these things that are happening in the millennium. And then you have this group of nations coming out of the north. This is one scenario. I don't think it has really much merit to it, because Jesus is ruling with a rod of iron. I don't even think the hooks in the jaws or something like that would even get off the ground. Do you?
No. I think the big argument is the one at the end, which a lot of people gravitate toward, which is
Let's go to that one. Explain it. So the final one is the one at the end of the millennium, where the phrase Gog and Magog reappears.
You should read Revelation 20 and see, while he's turning to it, what happens is at the beginning of the millennium, a single angel, a no-named angel, it may be Michael, we don't know, but it says an angel gets a big chain and bounds up Satan, and he's thrown into the bottomless pit. For the duration of the millennium, he's bound in the abyss, the bottomless pit. But it says he's going to have to be loosed again, and he's going to read about this.
Yeah, let me read chapter 20, verse 7. It says, "When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And then the devil who deceived them was captured and cast into the lake of fire." So that's the image. That's the language of what we have. The pros for that argument is you have this idea of Gog and Magog, a similar use of language. Okay, but that's probably, I think, the only thing in its favor.
Yeah, and I would recommend a book called Northern Storm Rising by Ron Rhodes. I've got a few arguments as to why they're not the same battle. I put this in the Millennium Prophecies DVD. We'll go through a couple of these arguments.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. The battlefields in Ezekiel 39 and 38 takes place on the mountains of Israel. But the Revelation 20 thing that Mondo just read, the troops surround the camp of the saints in the beloved city of Jerusalem. So they're going to the city and they're surrounding it. What's interesting is that Satan's found a multitude of people that he can deceive to do this, which means the sin nature throughout the Millennium Kingdom, even though Satan's bound, is in operation. And by the end of the millennium, it's taken hold of a lot of people. So Satan's able to deceive them and they come, but it's a different location, different battlefield. The defeats of Ezekiel 38 predicts a great earthquake, and every man's sword against his brother, pestilence, bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, brimstone. But only fire is coming down in Revelation 20, verse 9, one element of all those things. The troops are different. Ezekiel 38 identifies just a limited group of localized Muslim nations, apart from Russia, but led by Russia, that invade the north. Revelation 28 talks about an international army whose number is as the sand of the sea from the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. So it's not regional at all. The leaders of the invasion, Ezekiel 38 says it's Gog of Magog. But in Revelation 27, verses 7 through 8, it's clearly Satan, released out of the abyss. Just a couple more, and then we'll we'll wind it down. The timing of the burning of the weapons is important too. Ezekiel 39 emphasizes the weapons supply can provide fuel to burn for 7 years, but shortly after the second Magog prophecy happens that we just talked about, you have the white throne judgment.
Yeah, straight to it.
As you kept reading down, next
Yep.
thing you're going to be reading about the white throne judgment. And then after that, you go into the eternal order. This is not a time where they're going to be burning weapons. The other thing, too, is the timing of the regathering of Israel. It says in Ezekiel 38, all the Jews are brought out of the nations of the world in the latter years and dwell safely in Israel. Throughout the millennium, there's no hint of an additional Jewish dispersion. We'd have to bring the Jews all back home.
Yeah.
So the dispersion we're talking about is a dispersion that we've been witnessing for the last 73 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Regathering, rather.
I mean, we also see that no burning of the weapons. There's no discussion about burying for 7 months. It goes straight into, as you mentioned, the great white throne judgment. All the earth, the mountains flee. I mean, it's like the earth and the universe has been fled away because we're coming into this white throne judgment. It happens immediately. Secondly, when you look at Ezekiel 38, as we discussed earlier, you have 36 and 37 talking about them coming back from all the nations of the world in unbelief. It goes into 38 and 39 talking about the war, and then immediately goes into the millennial descriptions in chapter 40 of Ezekiel. It seems that if we go there, it'd be really out of order. It's kind of backwards.
That's right, yeah. I think you have a pretty good chronology. Not all of the Bible is chronological.
It's true.
But I think that section of Ezekiel through 34 through 40 through 46, a lot of gravity could be put toward that being chronological.
If we were to, summarize, we've spent really several hours now. I appreciate your time with me here because if we were to summarize, spend a minute summarizing really the most, what we would probably prefer as being the timing. We've discussed a lot. What's the preferred timing?
Well, I think when you put all the ingredients together, when's the best time for God to make the world put the world on official notice that He's the holy God? When you factor in the fact that He's dealing with my people Israel 3 times, the burning of the weapons fits like a glove if you put it in the gap for 3.5 years and then the first part of the tribulation for 3.5 years. I really think it's a pre-tribulation event, and I do believe that it probably happens in 3.5 years, perhaps 3.5 years before the start of the tribulation.
Yeah. So when we look at this, and we really just want to conclude with looking at all these details. We spent a lot of time looking at 38 and 39 as well as the context, and the reason why we felt that really the need to put this DVD together is because we're living in the times. We're watching prophecy be fulfilled. We're watching it happen. We're post even some of, we're certainly post Ezekiel 36 and 37 and the nation coming back in 1948. And we want to remind everybody that these are great ways to discuss prophecy, to discuss fulfilled prophecy, to discuss the truths of Scripture, not only as it relates to some of these things, but God does it, He does it to show off. He does it to show that He is the only one, He's the only God that knows the end from the beginning. And it provides opportunity for us to share these truths with those around us so that we can share ultimately the truth of salvation. I mean, any closing words that you have here?
Well, I think you did say it well because Isaiah 46 verses 9 and 10 says, I am God, there is no other, I am God, there is none beside me, declaring the end from the beginning. And I will accomplish all my will and my purposes will be done. I'm paraphrasing on that, but that's it. That's why I worship. That's how I came to know the Lord.
Yeah.
By studying the book of Revelation through Chuck Missler, a friend of ours, who's since passed away to be with the Lord. So, folks, you're living in the days of Ezekiel. We've already seen the regathering. Ezekiel 38 is coming. You need to, for one, get right with God, know God, learn prophecy, share that with your loved ones. And because these things are coming. When they come, the world changes. The world changes at that point.
Yeah. I really want to close this DVD series out with a prayer. So, join me as we pray. Join me, Bill. Father in heaven, we thank you for these truths, and we ask that you would take all of this information that we've done and that as it's going out, that people would use it not only to know you themselves, maybe this is the first time they've heard these things, help them to come to know you through really the gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus died for them so that they could come to know you in an eternal way. We also pray, Lord, that you would use this for those that are sharing it with others. We thank you for speaking to us. We thank you, Lord, that you love us so much and that you've gone beyond really all the things that we would think in order to reach us, to reach people with the truth. So we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the power of your word. We know that it is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. And we just pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you for watching. Thank you, Bill, for being here.
Mono.
And we hope you take this information and really educate yourself, educate others, and we'll see you the next time.